Hello and welcome to the CX Files for Thursday, 17th February 2022. My name's Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan, coming to you from Montreal, Quebec, in the heartland of Canada, where the trucker protest still lasts to this day, Mark.
We're talking to a good friend of CX Files this week, Stephen Loynd. Stephen is the founder and principal analyst at TrendzOwl. He's based just outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, in the shadow of the new Amazon headquarters building. He regularly gives us updates on LinkedIn about the construction of the building. Now, Steve, both Peter and I have known Steve for a long time, and we talked to him about the Great Resignation and the connection of this concept of the Great Resignation and how it connects to contact centers, CX, and what it means to have a career in CX. So it's an interesting conversation. You know, Steve is a deep thinker. You know, if you look at TrendzOwl, look at some of his essays. I mean, he thinks about things in a lot of detail and normally manages to find a connection to James Joyce as well.
Indeed, Mark, you're absolutely correct about Steve. I mean, full disclosure, he's a very, very close friend of yours, and he's a very close friend of mine. I've known Steve for nearly 2 decades. His resume speaks for itself, having been the contact center and CX lead analyst with IDC, with Frost & Sullivan, spent some time working for an outsourcer, and now as the founder and principal at TrendzOwl. He is truly a disruptor when it comes to CX thinking. And we're really on a topic that I think remains very front of mind for a lot of decision makers in our industry, and that is the Great Resignation. And as I was musing to you before our recording started today, and I can't believe I just used the word musing, but whatever. There was an interesting radio episode this morning I caught in an Uber on the way back home, talking a little bit about how the labor market's becoming a bit more fluid as many of the COVID benefits have run out, as many people's savings have run out. There's an increased willingness to get back into work. Now, we're going to need to see how this plays out over the course of the coming few quarters to identify if this is going to be a trend or not. But certainly the extent to which the labor market has been tight and the impact it's had on customer experience, whether it's in the front lines in stores or restaurants or in the contact center, certainly I think has been one of the biggest challenges I've seen since I've been in the market.
Yeah, and I think that there's multiple angles here, and it also comes back to another subject we've talked about quite often here, which is GigCX, and how we did the interview a week ago with Terry Reibel, and there we were exploring these ideas that GigCX may actually be a good reaction to the Great Resignation because you're offering people the kind of flexibility they want, the flexibility to choose their hours, to choose brands that they're working with. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see how effects like people wanting more flexibility from their job may well match up to some of the technology that we're seeing coming through at the moment.
Very true on all counts. And from what I've been observing, if you're going to be successful in the CX labor market, you've got to find innovative ways of being able to draw people in to do some of these roles. And GigCX is certainly a good way of looking at that. It's certainly a good approach. It's an innovative new one that needs to be tried by organizations if they feel that's the best way to work for them. But Mark, the reality is that innovation is going to be key. And it's a word that I think is overused, but when it comes to being able to attract talent and to be able to retain talent, there needs to be much more of an innovative approach other than just saying we're going to increase your salary by 1.5–2%, or we're going to have a Friday afternoon pizza party. That's not going to do anything to try and solve this problem.
Yeah. And I remember this from a lot of the tech firms that we used to see putting pool tables and stuff in their office. And I think that, this stuff just doesn't wash anymore. It's not good enough to have, a basketball hoop or a football table or something like that. I mean, people want real flexibility. They want decent pay and they want opportunities to grow.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head with those 3 points.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, why don't we just quickly look at any news or personal news or news about the industry.
Yeah, Mark, it's really interesting because I'll be making a return to the conference circuit in early April. I'm really pleased to let everybody know who is tuning into the pod today that on April 5th through to April 7th, the Winds of Change event will be taking place in Gdansk, Poland. Now, this is an outsourcing conference that's put on by Pro Progressio and the leadership there in the form of Victor Doctor. It promises to be a great, great, great event for the BPO community. Certainly, Central and Eastern Europe is probably the hottest single region right now when it comes to the extent to which many different organizations are looking to implant new outsourcing delivery centers. And with that in mind, I cannot wait to attend. If anybody in Poland is interested in coming or finding out more, they can let me know. Certainly anybody from Central and Eastern Europe or anybody with an interest in Central and Eastern Europe, this definitely needs to be on their calendar. And I look forward to talking a little bit about what are some of the emerging outsourcing offshore destinations that should be on the minds of anybody in the BPO space.
Okay, and I'm going to be making my first flight since the pandemic began next week to London. And so you will also be visiting London at the same time. And we have an
Correct.
event, don't we, that we're both going to be attending.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. It's going to be the book launch for Simon Danchuk's new tome, which is The History of Dolphin Square, a very prestigious and it sounds like a very infamous address in the annals of the Pimlico area of London. The event is on the 28th of February. If any listeners are interested in attending, definitely let Mark or I know so we can make sure that Simon puts you on the guest list. It's definitely an RSVP event. Lots of people from the BPO sector and the BPO community will be there. There'll be lots of other opinion makers, thought leaders, journalists, and politicians. It certainly promises to be an evening that nobody who is going to be there will ever forget.
Yeah, and as we were saying just before we started recording, I've been contacting a few people in London to say, let's get together and have a drink or a coffee or something. And it seems that half of them are all going to be at the book launch anyway. So it makes it very easy to catch up with everybody.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I just wanted to throw in one bit of news that I thought was interesting this week, and that's just the British Retail Consortium have published their footfall data. And what they've done is compared 2 years previously, instead of the normal like year on year, it's like year on 2 years. So January 2020 compared to January 2022. And it's really interesting because the declines are huge. If you look at shopping malls, they're down 37.5% in visitors. And even just like general footfall in the high street itself is down 24.2%. So, I think you're seeing this enormous decline in footfall. And I think that habits have changed throughout the pandemic. People have become more accustomed to e-commerce and just ordering online. And I think that there's other business models have been introduced. I saw William Carson talking earlier on LinkedIn about D2C and how many brands are selling directly. And, I'm doing that right now for stuff like pet food. It just comes directly from the manufacturer, some beers. And William was even saying that his car air freshener just comes automatically every 3 months. So, there's people have got different ways of shopping now.
They do, Mark, but I am going to throw a little bit of caution to the wind on this. I'll give you an example or two. Obviously, with the ability to go out to a store perhaps being more limited than it was a couple of years ago, I've gotten into the habit of shopping online, and I've had frankly some bad luck when it comes to footwear. And over the course of the past week or two, I've ordered 2 or 3 different pairs of shoes. I have not had any success with these shoes actually fitting. And what I've come to the conclusion is that there are some elements of the economy that we're shopping for that you just have to find a way of going into the store, whether it's going to be a traditional shoe retailer, a department store, maybe even a wholesaler. But certain things you just need to try on. You just can't take for granted. And that level of frustration I think that people have about certain aspects of the e-commerce economy are starting to come more to the forefront. And this is why I think that perhaps some of these dire numbers that have been published by the retail body in the UK certainly are emblematic of a change in habits. But I also think we're going to start seeing a rebalancing and a redressment and that'll come with a realization that certain products you just sort of need to go and you have to touch and feel.
Right. So let's stop talking and let's go straight to the chat about the Great Resignation and CX with Stephen Loynd. Okay, Steve, great to have you on the podcast. Now, I know that we're going to talk generally about the Great Resignation, and this is linked to the fact that every month we're seeing millions and millions of people leaving their jobs in the US. And originally there was this presumption that a lot of this was driven by people who were thinking of changing job before the pandemic, and then eventually taking action on this, because as things started calming down and the lockdowns finished, then they could actually look around for a new job. But it seems to just be going on month after month. It doesn't seem to just be that immediate reaction anymore. So do you really think that this Great Resignation people are talking about is a real effect?
Yes, thanks for having me again, Mark, and Happy New Year. And I think it's a great question to kick this thing off. 60 Minutes in the United States just had a piece on this 2 nights ago, and I'd encourage everyone to check it out, to Google the latest episode. And they emphasize that, certainly many people were considering a job change prior to the pandemic, as you said. But one thing they do a nice job of in the 60 Minutes piece is suggesting there may be a deeper search going on within people that's very much at play here. Some are asking themselves some kind of fundamental questions. What do I really want to do with my life? Type of questions, while a sizable population of people are also in search of more flexible employment situations. And some, of course, if not many or most, are seeking both of those things. And I've also noted that in a sense, I've been thinking about this, maybe we're already in what we're referring to as the metaverse in a way, in an odd way. In other words, because everyone is now on Zoom, spending much of their time home shored in their home offices. We're all seeing and hearing things across this giant online community like never before, at a level that we haven't seen before. So ideas and images are spreading in a way they haven't before. It's a network effect of ideas, if you really think about it. And one powerful idea is that people just don't have to take it anymore, and they want work that rewards them, and they want it to be reasonable. So I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, because I was thinking about this question, whether the pandemic itself was just a catalyst for change, or a trigger to change people's behavior, or whether there are some sort of more fundamental underlying reasons. And it seems that you'd certainly buy into that hypothesis as well then.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too. I thought a good metaphor for this was it's as if the pandemic was the bully who showed up on the playground. Now, we've seen what these kinds of hoodlums have done before. I'm thinking about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, for example. So you can't be in denial about what's going to happen, but deep down, you also know that over the longer term, this isn't about the bully at all, so much as it's about your own self-confidence and ability to respond to any threat and go forward. You'll need to stand your ground in that moment when it gets up in your face and such, and that the threat will eventually pass. But you'll still be there at the end of the day with whatever set of challenges remain that were there to begin with. So the point I'm trying to make is we need to understand that after this bullying pandemic is no longer a factor on the playground, advances in technology are going to mean that ways of working have changed forever, as we just touched upon, with hybrid working emerging as one new model. And so it seems to me that it follows that we'll need to recognize that it's how we look at our jobs that will be forever changed. The bully will eventually, hopefully, be rendered irrelevant, but technological change will have highlighted in a big way, and in some cases offered alternatives to many of the challenges of our old ways of working, our old paradigms.
Yeah, and on that point, I've heard some economists arguing that we do get sort of a cycle every 40 or 50 years or so of change. It's sort of a general societal change. And you can look back at the economic liberalization of the 1980s, and then go even further back to like the end of the Second World War, and how we saw like an embracing quite liberal values, the United Nations, the creation of social health care in European countries, for example. So I guess maybe we're due a change, and maybe there is going to be something bigger than we can see immediately.
Yeah, I mean, what's really cool is you and I and others have been talking about this since the pandemic hit on CX Files. We've had so many cool conversations. I think this idea of, I think it was hysteresis, the economic term for, when something changes, it never quite goes back to the way it was. It resets at a different level. And it seems like this is one of those moments that's been going on for a couple of years now, granted. But to your point, I think that the changes are going to stick in ways that some of which we've talked about and some of which we cannot anticipate, because things are rippling in ways that are going to affect our societies in different fundamental ways. And we still don't know what the full impacts will be.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to that kind of CX environment, if you look at the contact center, it's traditionally been quite a low wage environment, and even minimum wage in many cases. I mean, how does this industry need to react if, working in a contact center, dealing with the stress of customers abusing you hour after hour, it has a lower wage than going to Starbucks and serving coffee?
Yeah, I think that organizations, they need to respond with excellence. And I love referencing Tom Peters. I've done it before on the CX Files and in other contexts. But the idea being that organizations need to invest in their people and in the workplace to instill, a sense of great pride in what that organization is doing. The Little Big Things, I think, is the name of one of my favorite books that he wrote years ago. But everything matters. It's this idea that everything matters. And yes, that's also going to mean compensating people with competitive wages, but also opportunities to further people's education, perhaps grow and advance within the organization, et cetera. And then one other point I'd make is that the contact center environment, it also brings agents closer to an array of technologies and methods of using and implementing them. They can take those learnings, in other words, and those skills and build on them in a way that perhaps a barista at Starbucks can't. And the contact center is a great environment within which to learn essential people and leadership skills. And that's not to say that Starbucks isn't, for example, but you simply don't experience technology, I'd suggest, in the same way, perhaps, as you do in a contact center. And so, have a sense of idealism as an organization and instill it in your people if you can. It's the little details that matter, and dive into those details. And I can't articulate it as well as Tom Peters can, but that's an idea that's going to be so important in valuing people and their future going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, because if we look at the way that the modern customer journey takes place, and the way that the CX industry is responding to this, we're seeing a much greater focus on self-service, better results from Google searches, better results when you ask Alexa a question, but then also the kind of automation. If you go to an app or a website, first thing you're going to do is get a bot that can answer simple questions. So by the time you sort of reach that human in the contact center, it's like the third or fourth line of interaction with a brand. So we're expecting smarter, better people that really know their stuff. So that comes back to the thing about the wages. You would expect them then to be rewarded as brand experts and ambassadors, rather than someone getting paid minimum wage. But this comes back to the kind of contracting process. You look at all the CX companies and the contact centers, when they bid for business, everybody talks about FTEs and how can we get the absolute minimum full-time equivalent cost. So if we need 200 people in a contact center, what's the absolute minimum for each of those people? And the companies are bidding on these kind of like comparisons of cost. So how do we sort of educate the market about how things are changing and how automation, self-service is actually elevating the role of the humans in CX compared to the way that everybody still bids for the business?
Yeah, awesome question. For me, it's spell it out for the clients, show them the data. In other words, you take human beings out of the equation in the name of cost savings and watch revenues plummet in many contexts. It's a elegantly simple way to make your point. And if it's done in a nice visual graph for them in a presentation, they're going to get it. Go into the details. Revenue through the voice channel thrives via a human interface. They need to understand that in some use cases, automation, or call it digitizing in the name of cutting costs, can be useful in many contexts, but in other contexts, that means that revenues can go down, and sometimes those revenues will go down in the order of 60%, 75%, 90%. Those clients, those organizations, they need to understand that the conversion rate associated with specific streams of calls are that's a reality. There are scenarios where the conversion rates can be cut in half simply by misapplying automation, which, to your point, can be extremely useful in many contexts and in aiding and abetting the human beings. But always remember that the revenue productivity of the human interface is huge. And then one other quick point that we've talked about before, Mark, is this, and I find endlessly fascinating, is, while there is exponential technological change going on in a way that's affecting everything, when it comes to something like a chat bot, one might surmise, and I believe, that there probably won't be significantly or fundamental improvement over the next decade, say, with things like free-flowing conversation that will remain beyond the capability of a chatbot if algorithmic change is not keeping up with the change in compute capabilities and power, which is indeed exponential. But algorithmic sophistication has remained somewhat linear rather than exponential. And so you're going to need human beings to handle an increasingly confusing world that's spinning so quickly.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I think that one of the big mistakes many companies made was this assumption that you can stick a chatbot on the front end of your interface with the customer and just almost say, ask me anything, how can I help you? And you can't have a free-flowing conversation with a chatbot. It needs to be very specific and focused on the problem that needs to be solved. And you're right, there maybe in a decade we will have seen enough development to have some sort of conversations, but it's still going to require that human interface for a long time. And I guess the only answer to that really is to use chatbots smarter, to use them maybe as a way of gathering intent and gathering information about what the customer wants, and at the right point handing all that over to a human to actually then have the kind of more sales focused interaction.
Yeah, and I think it's this idea of what you just said and what I was saying. It makes the human being central to the CX, and companies need to value them, human beings that is, more than they are. I mean, I was thinking I saw in the news recently that here's one example of a mistake not to make. I mean, you got to value your employees. There's this thing going on at Google where they've suffered a recent setback in a labor case that was filed by some former employees who claimed the company had illegally fired, and there was surveillance going on after they had protested some of the business decisions around things like, Trump's Custom and Border Protection Agency and censoring in China and this type of thing. And so now Google has to hand over to the Federal Labor Relations Court something like 200 internal documents that it tried to keep confidential, including one in which a company lawyer says that it aimed to discourage workers from unionizing to convince them that unions suck or something like this. I don't know if that's a direct quote, but in other words, don't do that. Value your people in a way that is more sophisticated and forward leaning, because technology, and there's no greater technology company than Google, but you've got to remember in our context, the CX, the human interface is everything.
And so, I mean, it would seem that you could spin around this question about Great Resignation. The drivers seem to be companies that are not investing in their people, not providing flexibility, effectively not giving people agency, just telling them this is what you're going to do and you're going to do it from 9 till 5. And if you're 5 minutes late, you're going to get penalized, So if you give people back control over their day at work and some flexibility around their hours, and invest in their future, then I guess you can actually become an employer of choice. So it seems there's an opportunity here to actually sort of create a great retention. It just needs some smart employers.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, an employer of choice is something that so many BPOs, and I've worked at one of them during my time as an analyst to experience that world. And, so many of them claim they're the employer of choice because it's such a competitive space. Well, here's the great test now that they all face. And in tomorrow's world, who really are the employers of choice? And we're going to begin to see that more and more in the future. Distinction between BPOs is so tough to find anyway, but how you treat human beings is going to be a big differentiator. It always has been in this industry, but it's going to become more so in new ways.
Yeah, I think it always has been. But a lot of it's often been window dressing. It's like the stuff you put in the annual report about how much work we're doing for the environment or whatever. And now you're actually going to see, a direct impact on attrition based on how you're investing in your people.
Yeah, I mean, and you see it on LinkedIn all the time. That's right. Sometimes it's window dressing and sometimes it's not. And organizations, they need much more creativity in the ways in which they communicate what working in CX really means. It can mean everything. I mean, the best BPOs are reimagining themselves right now, and we know that. And they're transforming themselves due to everything from new technologies to the effects of the pandemic. Someday, we've even discussed they probably won't even be considered BPOs anymore in some sense, and that's a different conversation. But so too with individuals. I mean, keep learning, keep adapting. How many CSRs will wake up one day running their own tech business? And I suggest that there will be many of them. There's a lot of brilliant people that get their start in this industry. And there's all sorts of reinvention that's going to go on at a rapid pace, and that's going to just accelerate going forward because of everything that's going on.
So, I mean, just to wrap up then, I mean, we're talking about a sort of change in values towards the human element of CX, which really means a change in like the value of labor. So how do you think this is going to change our view around getting a job in CX and what it means to be working in CX over 2022, maybe into next year?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be we just come out of the Christmas season, and we're both big fans of James Joyce, and the great short story The Dead is based on and takes place on, I think, the Feast of the Epiphany, the idea that the central character has this great insight into his life, which he had never had before because he'd sort of been on automatic. And only Joyce can write it in such a brilliant way. But, to go back to the idea that we've been discussing about human beings and how central they are in this industry, and there's a light bulb moment to bring it back down to earth and what it means for clients. Revenue conversion rates in contact centers can be at least one order of magnitude higher than simply online, possibly more than that. So in other words, if you go to a website, and most do first, you're somewhere between 1/10 and 1/50th or whatever is likely to buy something as if you talk to an actual human being, because that's where the magic takes place. Revenue intensive applications are J-curve shifting, put another way, toward that human being on the phone. Productivity takes place there. And that's why I think productivity will actually, human productivity will only grow coming out of this. So both people working for contact centers and their employers should remember that they will become, I would suggest to you, even more valuable in tandem with automation and chatbots than they were before. And I think the best BPOs understand that. And you and I covered some of those guys, and we're seeing this epiphany start to spread across the industry. Those that don't get it aren't going to last.
Steve, that's great. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.
But it's very telling and very fitting, I think, that I go into the what's so funny? What?
No, sorry.
What happened?
we'll have to make that announcement again, because